She was fearless until she reached the street, when the blaze of shouts so terrified this young country girl that she fainted. Restored to consciousness, they had bound her weak hands, she cried, "Alas, do I still live?" Then quite consistently, she thanked her guardians for saving her from the crowd. She never for one moment looked upon her act as a crime. When interrogated at her trial, she adhered to this statement: "I saw civil war enveloping France. I considered Marat its chief cause, and to save my country I sacrificed myself and slew him." That her virtue was attacked at her trial is a condition of things which clearly proves how deeply dyed in prejudice, by this time, had become the revolutionary tribunals. One Chabot, under pretense of suspecting a concealed paper, tore off her breast kerchief. She leaped back at the outrage, the string of her dress broke, and her fair chest was exposed to the gaze of a number of savage men. Her hands were corded, so that she could not save herself from degradation, and her virtue gave of itself her best proof, for she crouched down to hide her disarranged dress. Entreating them to untie her hands, they complied, and turning her back to the wall, she rapidly completed her toilette. Where the cords had been, the flesh was marked with great blue bands, and very meekly she asked to be allowed to put on her long gloves before the knots were again tied. Upon her dress, after her death, was found pinned a long address to France, in which she entreated all men to destroy the Jacobins and save France. She was condemned to die the following morning. An artist, during her trial, having been remarked by her drawing her face, she requested he might complete it, and the painter was introduced to her cell. One man endeavored to save her by maintaining she was insane. In this shape of pity, he nearly lost his own head. She wrote of Marat finally, "Pardon me, O men, the name of Marat dishonors your race. He was a beast of prey seeking to devour France by war and hate. I thank heaven that by birth he was no Frenchman." She was pained by the accusation made by Chabot, the wretch who had torn away her neckerchief, who declared she had been his mistress, far more than by the thought of approaching death. "Chabot," she wrote, "is a mere madman. I never even dreamed of this man. He need not be feared. He has not intellect enough to be dangerous." In the same paper she said, "All Parisians are such good citizens, they cannot comprehend how a useless woman, whose longest term of life would be good for nothing, can calmly sacrifice herself for her country. Tomorrow, at 12, I shall have lived." Again she said, "T's crime gives the shame, it is not the block." This is the verse of the great French poet Corneille, who was her ancestor. Tried at 8 in the morning, and knowing she should die at midday, she said, upon leaving the prison, "Madame Richard, pray let my breakfast be ready upon my return, or we shall not have time to take it together." At her trial, it being maintained that the nature of the blow which killed Marat had been that of one accomplished in the use of the dagger, she cried, "Miserable wretch, he takes me for an assassin." The counsel for her defense urged that she only pleaded that in killing Marat she was doing a public good. The jury directly found her guilty and ordered her property to be confiscated. "Sir," she said to her defender, "you have done well, but I cannot pay you, for you have heard how my property has been seized. However, I do you this honor. I pray that you will pay the few pieces of silver I owe to the prison people. They ought to be paid." Going back to her prison, where the painter finished her portrait, she conversed about painting. A knock at the cell door, and the executioner entered, carrying scissors with which to cut away her hair, and the red garments worn by the condemned on their way to execution. "Sir," she said to the painter, "I can only offer you a lock of hair." And taking the jailer's scissors, she cut a lock of the wonderful hair. "A priest coming," she said, "I thank those who have been kind enough to send you, but I do not require your services. The blood I have spilt, and my own, which I am about to shed, are the only sacrifices I can offer the Eternal." The executioner now cut off her hair and flung over her head the red garment. "This," she said, "is the toilette of death, arranged by somewhat rude hands, but it leads to immortality." As she stepped upon the cart, such as carried all those condemned to death to the place of execution, a violent storm burst over Paris. Women danced about the death cart, uttering imprecations. Hers was the only calm face to be seen. Strangely enough, the rain wetting the red flannel, her only covering to the waist, it clung to her skin and betrayed her to be exquisitely formed, especially as her hands were so tied behind her that she was forced to hold herself upright. As she neared the scaffold, the sun appeared, and the gold threads in her hair shone out magnificently. The leaders of the rebellion, Danton, Robespierre, Camille Desmoulins, standing at a window, saw her pass. She had preserved them from Marat, but at the same time she had shown how a tyrant could be slain. She saved their lives by her act, but she taught also how they might be taken. One Adam Lux, a German, was hopelessly stricken by love as she passed along. He followed to the scaffold's feet, asking to die with her. Reaching the scaffold, she turned pale and for one moment shrank, but the next, recovering herself, ascended the steps as rapidly as her long red dress and pinioned arms would allow. When the executioner pulled down her dress, that her neck might be bare, she was for the last time outraged while living. She placed herself upon the plank, and the next moment her head fell. Legros, a miserable scaffold dog, took up the head by the remaining hair and struck at the cheeks. It is said the skin grew scarlet, as though the modesty of Charlotte Corday outlasted her life. Did her face change color? Some hold that the head has consciousness and power after being severed from the body, and that it can see and hear. Nay, it was urged during the Revolution that the passion of the heads remained, because the interior of the wicker baskets in which the heads were carried away were often found to be gnawed, as though the teeth of the heads gnashed after separation from the body. For my part, I believe that this gnawing was effected by rats, which at that time, even more than now, overran Paris. Such was the death of Marat, of his murderer, whom we cannot praise. But who can blame her? Assuredly her death was necessary to purge her of assassination to some extent. Adam Lux, wild with love, published a defense of Charlotte Corday. He was seized, and 3 days afterwards died by the very knife which destroyed her life. Chenier, the patriotic poet, sang her heroism. He was soon arrested and therefore beheaded. But what good had Charlotte Corday done? She had strengthened the love of the people for desperate measures. She had made a martyr of their most foul leader. She gave a dignity to those who advocated the scaffold. The liberal 22 knew that this last act annihilated them. Decorative separator. Chapter 58. Marie Antoinette. The convention ordained the worship of Marat and cast his corpse to the people as an idol. He was called Caesar, and his funeral was modeled upon the historical narrative of that given by Rome to the great Julius. The body was carried by torchlight to the garden of the house, in which he made his most inflammatory speeches, and there he was buried under trees heavily laden with countless brilliantly illuminated paper lamps. His head was placed in an urn and hung in the center of the convention. His memory was decreed an altar, and at its foot his admirers appropriately called for blood. The enemy was now approaching on all sides, and thousands more royalists were in array. Meanwhile Danton was sinking in estimation, Robespierre rising, for Robespierre was a patient man. Danton, dazzled with his new wife, wished to live the life of a small country gentleman. It was too late. Robespierre was breaking in health, but his temperance would stand him in good stead of health for a long while. His motto was wait. The Committee of Public Safety was meanwhile reaping a rich harvest of death. Money was no longer to be seen. Bread was rare. People were dying of starvation, especially the old, in every street. The more cruel of the conventionists carried by acclamation these decrees, the true legal inauguration of the Reign of Terror. 6,000 soldiers and 1,200 artillerymen to do blindly the bidding of the Committee of Public Safety. All men who have been in the government occupation during the late king's life to quit Paris. The delivery of the revolutionary tribunal of the moderate conventionists. the right to search any house at any hour of the night, the transportation beyond the seas of every common woman in the land. Finally, the payment of workmen who should leave their shops to follow up the public service. By these measures, the mob were not only encouraged to take life, but paid to do it. Nothing could save such a system, resulting, if long continued, in national death. By the way, Sunday was chosen as the best day for working these mob committees. This was followed by Merlin's decree, which provided for the arrest, without proof, of any suspected person, and of all those who, not working, were enabled to live in a better condition than one of penury. This was an attack upon all people who had hidden money. In fact, starvation had by this time become the only mode of avoiding the guillotine. Prisons were not large enough to contain prisoners, and all the confiscated churches were converted into jails. Death was decreed for almost every act of life, certainly for every act of pity. 100 men, less 2, were beheaded in 60 days in Paris alone. The Queen was too noble a victim to escape. The conventions suddenly ordered her trial and commanded her separation from the 2 children. Now all the lethargy which has possessed her since the king's death departs, and she becomes as a lioness fighting for her young. By this time, all the beauty of Marie Antoinette had vanished, and there remained a very broken old woman, aged about a little more than 30, with very scanty white hair falling in patches from an almost bald head. The body, as the soul, had shrunken, a skeleton remained, covered with mere skin. This was the Queen, who leapt into life when her dulled hearing comprehended that she was to be separated from her children. They had but the mercy only to remove the son. The boy clung to his mother, who lost all dignity, dug her nails into the child's flesh, and called upon the men to kill them both. For 2 hours this lasted, and then she became a woman again, a mother, and dressing him to look as smart as possible, she gave him up with her own hands to his jailer, Simon, who took him at once to the room where the child was destined to die. For 2 days and nights, the child lay upon the floor, taking neither food nor drink. The Queen never took her son in her arms. He was to outlive her but a little time, and then die of sheer ill-usage and neglect. The Queen, however, still had her husband's sister and her daughter with her. The only consolation they had was ascending to the platform of their tower to catch a glimpse of the boy on the platform of the other tower. Simon's work, it was to deprave the body and soul of the wretched child. He forced him to drink strong wine and made him answer to the name of wolf. He beat him if he wept, encouraged him to every possible disgusting act, and compelled him to sing obscene songs, while he, his master, smoked and drank. Once he nearly destroyed one of the poor prince's eyes. At another, he raised a poker against him. Sometimes he was kind, and upon one occasion he said, "Capet, if the soldiers come and deliver you, what will you do?" "Forgive you," said the child. The man Simon actually wept, but he cried immediately afterwards, "There's some of the blood of the lion in the whelp." In the middle of the night of the 2nd of August, the Queen was awakened and told she was to be removed alone to another prison. In vain, the women threw themselves at the feet of the men. They had but their duty to do. The Queen was compelled to dress before them, while they ransacked the room and seized every little object the Queen still retained. The miserable creatures left her a handkerchief. And now, exactly as Louis XVI had told his children to forgive their enemies, so now desolate Marie Antoinette told her daughter, in her last words to the poor child, to forgive those who parted them. "I give my children to you, sister, be a second mother to them." For precisely as Louis appears to have had no conception of the monstrosity of putting a woman to death, so the Queen, in leaving the Temple, appears not to have supposed for one moment that the Princess Elizabeth would be claimed by the scaffold, she who had led the life of a true woman, who had nursed and helped the people, and never joined in the frivolities of the court. The Queen was taken to the prison of the Conciergerie, which is composed of the dungeons below high water mark, to be found amongst the foundations of the Palace of Justice. To a wretched cell, having in one corner a straw bed, and by the light of one candle was the ex-queen taken. A woman desirous of death in the dungeon of a stronghold, and yet they only believed her safe when two soldiers, swords drawn, stood at the outer door watching, with orders not to lose sight of the widow Capet, even when asleep. Madame Richard, that good woman who tended Charlotte Corday in her last moments, was the Queen's most humane jailer. She found something like furniture for the cell, procured wholesome food for the captive, and often brought a low-whispered message from the royal prisoners still in the temple. A little while, and the dampness of the cell rotted the Queen's only dresses, two very common ones, and her underclothing becoming in tatters, she was half naked. Decorative separato. Chapter 59. Marie Antoinette finds peace at last. Marie Antoinette, in her last prison, however, was not without pitying friends. The fierce communists ordered that she should drink the water of the Seine, drawn as it flowed past her prison walls, but an honest couple, named Balt, obtained the posts of chief jailers at the conciergerie, in the full aim of assuaging the Queen's wretchedness. Instead of Seine water, the poor prisoner found daily in her cell refreshing draughts of water drawn from that well at Versailles, which was the Queen's chief cellar. She was a great water drinker. Madame Balt, to affect harshness, never entered the princess's cell, asserting that to do so was to be contaminated. The royal tradespeople of former days, especially the fruit women, brought little offerings secretly, and so it came about that the Queen, in her last prison and days, ate such pure, simple meals as those which had been her favorite food in the old days: a piece of melon, a handful of figs, a little bread, and a glass of water from her favorite well. The two gowns which the Queen possessed, one white, the other black, and which she wore alternately, soon fell to pieces in the damp prison. Her underclothing was always damp when put on, and often her shoes would be completely wet, for between her and the river there was only the part protection of a wall. Human nature demands some work. Not allowed writing or sewing materials, Balt's daughter mended the Queen's tatters and gave away the little fragments which she cut away in the process as relics of the poor lady. With a pin she scratched her thoughts upon the driest portion of the walls of her prison. After her death, many of these sentences were copied by one of the commissioners. They were mostly German and Italian verses bearing reference to her fate, and little Latin verses from the Psalms. No French did she use, for she had been brought into the land where that language was spoken to be cast into prison and to suffer death. The drier walls were covered with these mute appeals. Some idea may be gained of the cruelty exercised towards the desolate prisoner, when she, asking for a lighter coverlet, and Balt forwarding the request to a high authority, the latter received this reply: "Take care, another sign of sympathy such as that, and you will visit the guillotine before she does." Another shape of industry did the poor Queen find. She wished to leave her daughter a memento of her last days, and she had nothing to give. So she converted a couple of bone toothpicks into knitting needles, pulled some worsted shreds from the heavy old coverlet, which they refused to replace with a lighter, and knitted a garter. This she dropped near the friendly Balt, who, with the heart of a father, understanding the poor little bit of workmanship, let fall his handkerchief, and so possessed himself of the little treasure. After her death, the tribute reached the young princess, for whom it was worked, truly a message from the grave. A few days before her trial, an order, possessed by something of mercy, arrived, by force of which she was relieved from the continuous stare of the guards set to watch her. By this relief, she was enabled to kneel, from which act she had been warned throughout her confinement. On October 13th, Fouquier Tinville notified to Marie Antoinette the fact of her having been indicted for high treason. She listened to the reading of the indictment as though to a death warrant, the shape, in fact, it really took. As a matter of form, she chose two counsel for her defense, men who had secretly sought the appointment, and who, afterwards, of course, paid for their pity with their lives. On the 14th, at noon, she made as elegant a toilette as she could, hid the rags and the patchiness of her white hair as much as possible, and went up the stone stairs of her dungeon to the judgment hall above her prison. The passages were full of people who reviled her as she passed along. She bore her head well up, but she could not change the fallen mouth, the pinched nose, tarnished eyes, and shrunken, weakened body. But the black circles round those eyes artificially increased their failing brilliancy, and they fired glances of scorn and fearlessness at her gibing enemies. She had never possessed the humble, religious feeling and sweet patience which distinguished Louis. A perfectly pure woman at heart, she was somewhat of a Voltairean. She despised death and feared no power. We are as we are made, so in her final trial she met the scowls of the people, chiefly of women, face to face. Some authorities say that one girl uttered a cry of pity as the queen passed. She was strangled. These unsexed wretches had undertaken to accompany the queen to the scaffold with every possible indignity. And she stands before her judges. "What is your name?" "I am called Marie Antoinette of Lorraine in Austria," she replies in a low, musical voice. "Your condition?" "Widow of Louis, formerly King of the French." "Your age?" 37. Lauquier Tinville now read the indictment. It was the summing up of all her declared crimes of high birth, condition, and rank. She was quite guilty of all these things. The chief accusations were merely echoes of all that had been whispered of her in the foulest places. She was accused of prodigality, licentiousness, and treason to France. She showed no sign of emotion, beyond an unheeded movement of the fingers over the bar of a chair, as though they were recalling some half-forgotten music. She answered all questions quite patiently, showed sorrow only when reference was made to the Princess de Lamballe, and only lost her quietude when one Hebert was called. It is to be hoped this man was mad. At all events, he spoke to the queen's axe while in the temple, declared that she was depraved and debauched, and that she had even corrupted her own son, that she might poison his body and his soul, and so reign in his name over the ruin of his understanding. This man was mad, there can be no doubt upon the point. He even included saintly Madame Elizabeth in this frantic, idiotic accusation. Heaven be thanked, those present turned upon him and cried, "Shame!" The queen herself shrank, raising her hand as though to guard her from the wretch. But one juryman was nearly as bad as Hebert. "Why does not the accused answer?" this foul wretch asked. "I do not answer," she said, and once again, it is said, she looked radiantly beautiful in her momentary indignation, because these are accusations to which nature refuses a reply. She turned to the women with whom the court was crowded. "I appeal from him to all mothers present. To the honor of these women be it said, they cried Hebert down, and so he passes out of this history." The queen met questions having reference to the king with equal calmness, it being alleged that she endeavored to obtain ascendancy over him through his mental weakness. She replied, "I never knew that character of him. I was but his wife, and it was my duty and my pleasure to yield to his will." By not one word, tending to save herself, did she injure the memory of her husband. One line in the trial is enough to show what a mockery it was. The public prosecutor cried, "All France bears witness against this woman." For form's sake, the jury deliberated an hour. She was recalled to hear her sentence, but the cheering and screaming of the people told her its terrors before the judge spoke, "Death." 9 months since the king died, and now there was an end to her weary waiting. Asked if she had anything to say why the sentence of death should not be carried out, she respected herself in her very silence and turned away as though quite prepared for execution. It was now 5 in the morning, and her last day was come. At 5:30, she was permitted to write a letter to the king's sister, Madame Elizabeth. This lady never saw it. The document was found long afterwards amongst the papers of one Couthon. "I write to you, my sister," she begins, "for the last time. I have been condemned not to an ignominious death that only awaits criminals, but to go and rejoin your brother. Innocent as he, I hope to show such firmness as the King S in his last moments. I grieve bitterly at leaving my poor children. You know that I lived but for them and you who, in your love, have sacrificed all for us. I learnt at my trial that you are separated from my little girl. In what a position I leave you. I dare not write to her. They would not give her my letter, and indeed, I do not know that you will receive this. Some words of this final letter are inexpressibly touching. Let my son never forget his father's last words. Let him never seek to avenge our deaths. She then goes on to apologize for the child's possible conduct to her, after the influence over him necessarily obtained by Simon, his tutor, and meekly she urges that he is so young he is incapable of knowing what he does. Think of me always, she says in conclusion. Good heaven and my children, how heartrending it is to leave them forever, forever. This letter being finished, she kissed each page lovingly and folded it. So far, the Republic had not entirely declared against high heaven, and priests were still recognized by those who had subscribed to the Articles of the Revolution, and one of these men was offered to Marie Antoinette to aid her in her last moments. She refused to see him. The convention, still sitting, insisted upon one of these officials accompanying her to the scaffold. There was no devotion amongst them. All hesitated, for all feared that the Queen would be torn to pieces on her way to the scaffold. One proffered his help. "Thank you," said the Queen. "I have no need of your services, though I am a great sinner, but I am about to receive a great sacrament." "Martyrdom," said the priest in a low voice, and he bowed and retired. She prayed alone. However, she had been secretly informed that at a certain house on her way to execution, a minister would be stationed, who would give her absolution as she passed in the cart. She dressed herself in the white gown, put a white cap on, bound with a black ribbon, and so came before the people. Then she drew back. Her queendom still remained. She had not thought the people so fallen that she should be taken to the scaffold in the common cart. The king had been taken to death at least in such a vehicle as he had been accustomed to. Alas, when Louis died, all pity had expired. With her death, all France was to gasp with thirst for blood. She mounted the cart, her hands having been bound behind her, and in the midst of a raging crowd. The cart swayed, and she could scarcely keep her seat on the plank. She grew red and pale by turns as she was dragged through the mob. The patience and pity exhibited by the king she could not imitate. Her lips were bitter each moment, but she never took her dry, hot eyes from the raging people. Suddenly her head falls humbly, and her hands being tied, she makes the sign of the cross by 3 motions of the head. Her pride had passed with that unseen blessing from the house on her way to execution. When the palace of the Tuileries came in view, the place where she had spent nearly half her life, tears fell down her face. A few turns of the wheels, and she was at the foot of the scaffold. Reaching the place, accidentally she trod upon one of the executioner's feet. "Pardon me," she said, in a sweet, courtly voice. She knelt for an instant, rose, stretched her neck towards the distant towers of the temple, and cried, "Goodbye, my children, I am going to your father." She did not, like her husband, speed to heaven. It was rather that she fled from earth. The executioner was trembling more than his victim, so that she suffered a long agony of a few moments after she was upon the plank. The assistant executioner took his brother's place. The head fell. It was taken up and carried around the scaffold. "Long live the Republic," saluted this brave display. The revolution thought itself avenged. It was befouled. She came a foreigner, and they killed her. Thus she died. Frivolous in prosperity, she died with intrepidity. Her misfortune was her mistrust of the people in her early days, her catastrophe, that all the sin and wickedness of the court was laid to her account. Called upon to fill a throne, those who called her gave her not even a tomb, for you may read in a parish register, "For the coffin of the widow Capet, 6 shillings." With her life, France threw away all Christian mercy. Crimson swept over the breadth and length of the land. Decorative separato. Chapter 60. The 22. The 22 had literally been under the control of the police, though not arrested, since May 31st. But as events progressed, their destruction became almost necessary to the safety of those members of the convention, who, obtaining power wholly through the will of the more violent, could only retain it by a perfect recognition of the will of those who had given them the victory. The 22 were therefore seized and placed in a building converted from a convent into a prison, and here they made full preparations to die. To this day, the walls of this place may be seen covered with mementos of the prison days of the victims of the Revolution. They are chiefly short verses, written in blood, the purple hues of which many of the inscriptions still retain. A few days after the Queen's Day of Peace arrived, their trial commenced. Of what were they accused? Really nothing, but they were in the way, and a threatening division of the masses insisted upon their death. After 4 days, mockery of justice, the 22 were declared guilty of having conspired against the unity and indivisibility of the Republic, and the whole were condemned to die. A cry of horror burst from the condemned, for many of them could not believe that innocent men could be sent to the scaffold. Valets, one of the youngest, slipped from his seat to the floor. "What, Valets, art losing courage now?" cried his friend Brissot, upholding him. "No, I am dying," returned Valets, and his fingers quivered about the handle of the poniard with which he had taken his own life. Silent horror for a moment prevailed. The Girondists blushed and bowed their heads before their dead companion, who had given them an example of fearlessness in meeting death. Only one, named Boileau, showed cowardice. He cast his hat into the air and screamed, "I don't belong to these men, I am a Jacobin." But instead of pity, he only gained contempt. And now a cry was heard. It came from Camille Desmoulins. "Let me fly," he cried. "It is my book which has killed them." But the crowd seized Desmoulins and forced him to remain. The 22 came down from the high seats upon which they had heard their trial and sentence, and for a moment stood round the dead body of their friend, who had shown them how to die. Almost simultaneously, they raised their hands and cried, "Innocent, long live the Republic." Then they cast all the money they had with them amongst the crowding, storming people who greedily seized it. This was done not to excite the mob to revolt, but with the thought that, their death at hand, they had no farther need of wealth. There was something strangely classic and Roman-like in their death. They left the hall singing loudly the celebrated hymn, the Marseillaise, and in reference to their death, they sang with amazing power the celebrated 2 lines. March on, O children of the land. The day, the hour of glory is at hand." This terrible hymn they were still singing as they entered their prison. It was now late in the evening, and they were to suffer on the following morning. The tribunal had decreed that the yet warm corpse of Valets should be carried back to prison, conveyed in the same cart with his accomplices to the scaffold, and interred with their bodies. The only sentence, perhaps, which punished the dead. 4 men-at-arms carried the body upon a litter, and thus the procession reached the prison. The 22 were to pass the night in the same room, the corpse in one corner. The 21, even Boileau, who repented of his momentary cowardice, came, one by one, and kissed the dead man's hand, then covered his face, saying, "Tomorrow, brother." One Bailul, a Girondist and a Conventionist, but who had escaped the proscription, yet had not left Paris, had promised that, after the trial, he would prepare and send to the prison either a triumphant or a funereal supper, according to the sentence. The promise was kept. Upon the oaken table, stretching the length of their dungeon, was set out a supper, royal in its magnificence. Every luxury to be obtained, every delicate wine with a name, filled those portions of the table not covered by a wealth of flowers and great clusters of brilliantly burning wax candles. To one Abbe Lambert, who lived 50 years after that night, we owe all we have learnt concerning that final meal. This minister was waiting to offer consolation to the condemned as they passed to the scaffold. The supper lasted from midnight until the dawn of day, at the end of October, about 5:30. It was the feast of their marriage with death. No sign was given of their approaching end. All ate with sobriety, but with appetite, and it was only when the fruit and wine alone remained on the table that the conversation became excited and powerful. Many, especially the younger men, who did not leave families behind them, were very gay and witty. They had done no great wrong and were sacrificed to duty, therefore they met death with cheerful faces. With solemn break of day, the conversation became graver. Brissot cried, "Now that we, the honest men amongst those who govern, are about to die, what will become of the Republic? How much blood will it require to wash away the memory of ours?" "Friends," cried Vergniaud, "we have killed the tree by overpruning it. It was aged, Robespierre cuts it down. Will he be more fortunate than ourselves? No, the land of France is now too weak for honest growth. The people play with laws as children with toys. They are too weak to govern themselves, and they will return to their kings as children to their toys after they are tired of having thrown them away. We thought ourselves at Rome, we were in Paris, but in dying, let us leave to the whole of France the strength of hope. Some day, some great day, she will be able to govern herself." At 10 o'clock, the executioners arrived to prepare the victims for the scaffold. Gensom, picking up a lock of the black, brilliant hair cut from his head, gave it to Abbe Lambert and begged him to carry it to his wife. "Tell her," he said, "it is all I can send, and that I die thinking of her." Vergniaud drew his watch from his pocket, scratched his initials and the date in it with a pin, and sent it by the hands of one of the executioners' assistants to a young girl whom he loved deeply, and whom it is said he intended to marry. Everyone sent a something to someone or more in memory of himself, and it is pleasant to be able to state that every message and remembrance were faithfully delivered. When the last lock of hair had fallen, the victims were marshaled, and they were led out to the carts waiting to receive them. They sang the Marseillaise to the scaffold. They sang it when they reached it, the song growing fainter and fainter as each head fell, and the hymn only ceased as the last head fell, that of their leader, Vergniaud. The dead body of their friend was carried with them. Such was the end of the founders of the French Republic. With them the brightness, beauty, youth, wit, frankness of the Convention passed away, and their places were filled by sullen, threatening men. Decorative separator. Chapter 61. The Red Flag. The first to fall was the Duc of Orleans, father of Louis Philippe, king of the French. He had done nothing against the interests of the Republic, but his birth was a crime, and his death was decided on. The prince and his sons were at table when the fatal indictment arrived. "So much the better," said he, "this must end one way or the other. Kiss me, children, and I wonder of what they accuse me," he said, opening the paper. "The scoundrels," he added, "they accuse me of nothing. Come, boys, eat, for this summons is indeed good news." He was taken to Paris, where at this time no man of mark, being put upon his trial, escaped the guillotine. The one plausible accusation brought against Orleans must have compressed his heart. "Did you not vote the king's death in the hope of succeeding to his throne?" "No, I obeyed my heart and my conscience." He heard his sentence calmly, despite the fact of his cowardice in his early years, and he replied sarcastically to his judges, "Since you were determined to condemn me, you should have found better pretexts than you have. For as it is, you will deceive no man into believing that you think me guilty. I am in the way. And you too," he said, turning to a once Marquis d'Autenel, an old friend, "you to condemn me. Finally," he continued, "since I am to die, I demand not to be left in jail a whole night, but to be at once taken to the block." This desire was not complied with. Returning to the jail, his rage was terrible. The Abbe Lambert approached and said, "Citizen Equality, will you accept my assistance, or at least the offer of my condolence?" "Who are you?" "The Vicar General of the Bishop of Paris. If you will not accept my religious help, can I be of any service to you after your death? Have you messages to send? No, I can die without help, and like a good citizen. He went to the place of execution at 3, accompanied by 3 others. Reaching the scaffold, he looked at the knife calmly, and the executioner offering to remove his boots, he said, "You will do it more easily afterwards." He was dressed very beautifully for his death, and he died without fear. He had followed the revolution blindly, had thrown away fortune, name, reputation in its cause, and it destroyed him simply because he had belonged to royalty. Terror was rapidly reddening all the land. The guillotine was not quick enough, and squads of soldiers shot down the condemned. Such sentences as the following were accepted as truths. The time is come when the prophecy shall be fulfilled, the wealthy shall be despoiled, and the poor shall be enriched. If the people want bread, let them profit by the sight of their misery, to seize on the possessions of the wealthy. Do you seek a word which furnishes all you need? Die or cause others to die. The Great Terror began at Lyons. The great day of vengeance has arrived, cried one collier. 500 men amongst us deserve to share the fate of the tyrant. I will give you the list, be it your part to strike. He then seized a crucifix, dashed it upon the ground, and trampled upon it. Here is another theory which was applauded. Any man can be an executioner. It is the guillotine which really takes life. This collier who had trampled upon the crucifix clung to it when condemned to the death he was always seeking for others. The knife was blunt, and 5 times it was raised before the head fell. "Quick, quick," the wretch cried when it was raised for the 5th time. Some time after, when the terror was rising to its height, Collier was looked upon as a martyr. His body was burnt, and the ashes placed in an urn were carried triumphantly through the streets and placed upon an altar of patriotism raised to him. The altar in question was soon thrown down, but only after the terror ended. With Collier's after-death triumph, the moderates began to fall. 10 of the municipals of Lyons, the place of Collier's exploits, were beheaded in one day, and a mine was exploded which destroyed the finest parts of the city. Lyons was almost annihilated. At a cost of 500,000 of money, English, houses worth 12 millions were destroyed. Why? France was mad. So hurriedly was this destruction effected that hundreds of the workmen themselves were buried in the ruins. Life, however, was cheap. Rags only were to be seen. A decent dress was equivalent to condemnation. The city was dead, but for the thunder of fallen houses, the roar of cannon, and the rattle of musketry mowing down suspected people, and the shrill cry of the ragged as they marked another head fall beneath the guillotine knife. It was now looked upon as a distinction and reserved only for important people. An entire generation was destroyed in Lyons alone. Great houses were unowned, for their owners were dead. Castles, churches, factories, workshops were closed, for their heads had all passed under the guillotine. Starvation increased, for the land lay a-dying. The guillotine was getting old and worn out at Lyons. One morning 64 are marched out to death. They are bound and ranged in a line before an open trench. 3 pieces of cannon, loaded with bullets, sweep the ranks. Not half are touched. Forward is the word given to the dragoons, who hack and shoot down the victims. This lasts 2 whole hours. 930 executioners, in the shape of an entire regiment, were to send their victims, marshaled in a row, into eternity at the same moment. At the order fire, 4 bullets struck at the life of the victims, all of whom are tied to a rope stretched from tree to tree. Strange, when the smoke arose, only half were found dead. The rest remained either wounded or untouched. The unscathed stared in horror, the wounded screamed to be dispatched. The soldiers could not fire again. Some of the prisoners had freed themselves and were escaping. The dragoons were ordered forward to cut them down. The victims were killed piecemeal. One man, a mayor of his town, reached the river, but there his bleeding hand betrayed him, and he was cast into the river. The soldiers protested against the use to which they were put. The massacres lasted until nightfall, yet when the gravediggers came next morning, some hearts still beat. The sextons put the martyrs out of their misery at once by blows on the head with their pickaxes. "We are purging the land," wrote Collot de Herbois to the convention. Every day 22 were regularly shot. By this time, the fear of life rendered death sweet. Girls, men, children prayed that they might be shot with their parents. Sometimes they permitted this, and little boys and girls were shot, holding their fathers' hands. Women who were seen to shed tears at executions were shot. Mourning was prohibited under pain of death. One lad of 14 says, "Quick, quick, you have killed Papa, I want to overtake him." One de Rochefort was accompanied by a son to the butchering ground, whither he went with 3 relatives. The men fell, the boy, aged 15, remained standing. The executioner hesitated, the people murmured. "God save the king," cried de Rochefort. A moment, a report, he fell shattered to death. A lovely girl, 14, is brought before the judge for refusing to wear the national cockade. "Why do you refuse to wear it?" asks the judge. "Because you do," replies the child. Her beauty rather than justice, pleading for her, a sign was made that a wreath should be put in her hair, the emblem of liberation. She cast it upon the ground, she died. A man came to the hall of justice. "You have slain my father, my brothers, my wife, kill me. My religion forbids me to destroy myself. In mercy, kill me." In mercy, they killed him. A woman who had fought bravely in the earlier and fairer time of the Revolution was carried to the scaffold, though about to become a mother. She did not fear death, she pleaded for the other life. She was laughed at, hooted, and so died. A girl of 17, and much resembling Charlotte Corday, was accused of having served as an artillerist in the trenches of the forces opposed to the national forces. "What is your name?" "Mary, the name of the mother of the God, for whom I am about to die." "Your age?" 17, the age of Charlotte Corday. "How at 17 fight against your country?" "I fought to save it." "Citizen, we, your judges, admire your courage. What would you do with your life if we gave it you?" "Use it to kill you." She ascended the scaffold, alarmed at the crowd of people, fearless of death. She refused the executioner's help, cried twice, "God save the king," and lay down to die. After her death, the executioner found amongst her clothes a note written in blood. It was from her lover, who had been shot some days before. The lovers were only separated by a few days. Their history touched the people, but the people of that day did not know how to pardon. These awful executions were at last arrested, not because the victims were exhausted, but because the soldiers threw down their arms and positively refused any longer to play the shameful parts of executioners. Napoleon Bonaparte, the tyrant liberator of the oppressed republic, now rose to his first distinction. The English were in possession of Toulon. Admiral Hood was preparing to flood France with English redcoats. Within a week Bonaparte had compelled the English to retire, but not before they had destroyed the arsenal and the whole of the French navy. On the beach, 15,000 refugees from various parts of France sought to get away to the combined English and Spanish fleets. A storm arose in the midst of this destruction. 7,000 were rescued from the vengeance of the Republican arms, 8,000 perished. These refugees were chiefly carried to Leghorn, where their descendants still reside. The convention ordered that Toulon should be razed to the ground for having submitted to the English. This frantic order, however, was not carried out. Napoleon was now Emperor of Toulon. Already he disobeyed orders and rose daily to power. Marat had risen over the Girondists and liberals, Danton over him. Robespierre was to destroy Danton, but Napoleon was to set his foot upon them all, and command, until, in his turn, in 1815, he was to succumb. Decorative separator. Chapter 62. The Blood of Women. Madame Roland, who had now been imprisoned through 5 long months, was the next celebrated victim demanded by the people. She had conquered her weariness by writing her life. At one time, she sought to avoid death by poison, but the memory of her child prevailed, and she lived on to the end. When the Girondists fell, she knew all hope of life for herself was at an end. She was then removed to the prison whence Marie Antoinette went to the scaffold. Nay, she was imprisoned in the adjoining cell, and here she passed her days, watching the fragment of sky she could see through the bars of her prison, or admiring the little bunches of flowers the jailer's good-hearted wife sent to her dungeon almost daily. She was tried for being the wife of Roland and the friend of the Girondists. She was proud of the accusation, declared herself to be so, and she heard her condemnation to death with a calm bearing and a smiling face. "I thank you," she said, "that you think me worthy to share the fate of great and good men." That same day she was placed in the last of a number of carts, her only companion being an old man. Her beauty was more than radiant, seated so near trembling age. She wore a white dress, and her long black hair streamed down her back. Near the scaffold had been erected a colossal statue of Liberty. When she ascended the scaffold, she bowed to the statue and cried, "O Liberty, how much crime is committed in your name." But she had shown her woman's tenderness at the foot of the scaffold. She said to her companion, "Go first, that you may not see me die. Let me save you that pain." She died quite fearlessly. The next day, some peasants, driving home their flocks, found the dead body of a man, a sword-stick blade through his heart. The position of the remains proved suicide, effected by putting the sword handle against a tree when the sufferer flung himself upon the point. A paper found upon the dead man contained these words: "Whoever thou art that findest these remains, respect them as those of a virtuous man. After my wife's death, I will not remain another day upon this earth, so stained with crimes." This was Madame Roland's husband. Very different from this honest woman's death was that of Madame du Barry, mistress of Louis XV. Her crime was the concealment of a treasure. As a king's favorite, she had amassed enormous wealth. Strangely enough, it was a favorite of her own, a Negro boy she had adopted, that denounced her. She was condemned, and she went shrieking to the scaffold, the only instance of this kind amongst all the women who died during the Reign of Terror. Her beauty was her crime. "Life," she cried, "life for repentance, for devotion to the Republic, all my treasures for a little life." The knife only cut short these ignoble cries. The next thing done was the abolition of the name of the days of the weeks and months of the year, because they were idolatrous. Finally, the Catholic faith was abolished, the church bells were cast into money, the worship of the goddess of reason was proclaimed. The proclamation was carried into effect at the cathedral. An actress, one M. Deal, Maillard, beautiful, talented, and a favorite of the late Queen's, was compelled to play the part of the goddess. She was borne into the church, the only one now open in all Paris, upon a kind of litter, covered with oak branches, and followed by girls dressed in white, singing jubilant songs. About the altar were the opera choristers and others. The actress was now placed upon the altar, and she was worshipped by those present. The bishop had been compelled to appear, and he sat motionless with fear, tears of shame coursing down his face. The burial places of the kings were now invaded. The remains of 1,000 years of kings were torn from the vaults of St. Denis and cast into the country ditches. Nothing was spared, anything which suggested royalty was destroyed. Meanwhile, Carrier, at Nantes, surpassed in outrage all that had gone before him. It was charitable to suppose he was sheer mad. Men, women, children, and especially priests were shot down by Carrier's orders. He said trial was useless. His rivals had abandoned the guillotine for the butchery of the soldiers' lead. Carrier improved upon this. He said he hated blood, so he positively sank hundreds, thousands of accused in huge barges. They were carried down to the bottom, and there to this day they remain. Carrier was the deputy sent by the Convention, of which Robespierre was now king. These massacres lasted months. Some complaints were sent to Paris. Carrier seized 200 of the principal merchants of the place, cast them into prison, tortured them, and then drowned the men. At last, his madness becoming apparent, he was recalled. Robespierre did not demand his punishment, and this omission of justice was one of the accusations brought against Robespierre at his trial. A woman began the attack upon Robespierre. She was Rose Lacombe, beautiful, eloquent, revolutionary, but pitying and hating blood. She was seized with love for a young prisoner, tried to save him, failed, and she devoted herself to Robespierre's death. Robespierre, to retain his popularity, determined to sacrifice Danton, Camille Desmoulins, and others. They fell, all of them. As these victims, on their way to execution, passed Duplessis' house, the shutters of which were closed, the crowd burst into a roar of applause. Robespierre, watching, trembled. A very short span, and his time was to come. Hérault de Seychelles was the first to alight from the cart. He turned to embrace Danton when the executioner pulled him away. "Brute," said Danton, "but you cannot prevent our lips touching in the basket." Camille Desmoulins was the last, but one of the four. He was quite resigned. He looked at the knife, then turning to the people, he said, "Look on at the end of the first apostle of liberty. He who murders me will not survive me long. Send this lock of hair to my mother," he said to the executioner. They were his last words. Danton ascended last. He never looked more haughty and defiant. For one moment he broke down. "Wife," he screamed. Then he added, "Come, come, Danton, no weakness. Executioner, show my head to the people. It is worth looking at." The executioner caught the head as it was falling and carried it round the scaffold. The mob applauded. Such is the end of favorites. 8,000 people were awaiting death in the prisons of Paris alone, within a month of Danton's death. Robespierre was delicate and decent in his power and supreme cruelty, but he capped all his compeers. Men and women were not shot or drowned in Paris, but the guillotine worked unceasingly. Certain children had, in 1791, taken part in receiving the Prussian general at Verdun. They were all brought to Paris and guillotined. The nuns of Montmartre were carried, abbess, young girls, and old women, all to the scaffold for praying. As the Girondists sang their hymns, so these poor women sang theirs. The last death ended the last note of this hymn. It was thus Robespierre, now alone of all those with whom he first came into power, and his satellites maintained their power. One and only one grown-up scion of royalty remained, Madame Elizabeth. It was then more than a year since the king died. She and the princess remained together, deprived even of cards, because of the kings and queens in the pack. As for the Dauphin, he was confined in a room the bed of which he never left. His bread was thrown to him, no one ever spoke to him, and his clothes had not been changed for nearly 12 months. His window would not open. He was allowed no books, paper, or playthings. In a word, he was brutalized at 6 years of age. His limbs stiffened, and he became an idiot, in which state he died. The aunt and sister could hear nothing about the child. They were treated tolerably well, but during Lent they were only given fat meat to eat. This their consciences would not allow them to touch, and for 40 days they only ate bread. The summons came suddenly at night time. The little princess, the only one of the 5 prisoners of the temple who survived the reign of terror, wept, clung to her aunt, but lost her. Her defense was very simple. "I am tried because I am the king's sister. You call him a tyrant. Had he been, you would not have been where you are, I not be where I am." The people demanded her life, and they obtained it. The very women who generally yelled around the carts were dumb, as this serene, angelic woman was carried through the streets. She died so peacefully that many envied her. Decorative separator. Chapter 63. Robespierre falls. Atheism was now preached openly. Robespierre pronounced in favor of an unknown deity, and in so magnificent a speech that it may be said he gave back religion to France. But his time had come. What was his crime in the eyes of his accusers? Unpopularity. One night he is addressing the convention when the uproar is so incessant that in endeavoring to make himself heard, his voice fails him. The people were already looking towards Napoleon, the man of the sword, not of the tongue. Robespierre fell back upon silence, but he was always to be seen at his place at the convention. Hour after hour, friends became enemies. He knew he was condemned, but he waited. Here is the final scene. Robespierre and his friends, Saint-Just, Couthon and Lebas, seated in a room by themselves, hear the jingle of approaching soldiers. Lebas takes one of a couple of pistols and presents it. Robespierre, let us die. No, I await the executioner, says Robespierre, and the other two murmur in assent. The sounds come nearer. A report, and Lebas falls. He has shot himself through the heart. The soldier insurgents swarm into the room. Down with the tyrant, where is he? These were the cries Robespierre heard. He did not quail. Which is the man? Asks a soldier of Leonard Bourdon, who did not face his fallen enemy. He pointed the questioner's pistol at Robespierre, and he said, "That is the man." The report was heard, and the next moment Robespierre's head fell upon the proclamation he was signing at the instant. The ball had entered the left side of the face, and carried away part of the cheek and several teeth. Couthon tried to rise, and fell to the ground. Saint-Just sat calmly glancing from his fallen friend to his enemies. The procession to the convention was horrible enough. It was now daybreak. First was carried Robespierre on a litter, his face tied up in a handkerchief. Then came his brother, insensible, in the arms of two men. Then followed the dead body of Lebas, over which they had thrown a table cover. Couthon, who had rolled in the mud, followed, and the procession was closed by Saint-Just, walking bareheaded. "The recreant Robespierre is here," said the president of the convention, "a man just chosen. Shall he be brought in?" "No, no," cried the conventionists. "The corpse of a tyrant can carry nothing but contagion along with it. To the scaffold." Robespierre was put aside in a room, and hundreds of people pushed in to assure themselves the tyrant was dead. He heard and saw all, but could not speak. At 3, he and his friends were tried. At 6, they were being conveyed in carts to execution. There was no lack of people to see Robespierre die. Women dressed as for a ball, believing that with Robespierre the reign of terror was at an end. Children huddled around the carts, orphans of his victims, crying, "Kill him, kill him." His procession to the scaffold was a line of loud-spoken imprecations. He never spoke or uttered a cry except when the bandage was taken from his face. Then a scream, heard many hundred yards away, burst from him. His head fell, he and the terror ended together. France fell into the hands of Napoleon. My tale is done. I have said very little about myself. I, René Besson, found in my old age by Alexander Dumas, seated in the sunlight. I married Estelle Duplay. The Furies broke into the house of Duplay the day after Robespierre's death and killed his poor wife and found peace and happiness. One last word. I have never regretted saving Sophie Gerbaut and the Viscount de Malmy from the terror. That I did. I am now an old man. My very last words are these. The revolution was terrible, but it did the world more good in the long run than the world has yet found out. René Besson. The End.